Well, this Christmas thing is getting pretty serious, isn't it? Man, it's coming up. We got a lot of Christmas stuff going on, decorations. At Christmas time, a lot of people tend to travel. Have you ever had to travel for Christmas? Come on, raise your hand up in the air if you traveled for Christmas. Now, when we travel, a lot of people fly, and sometimes flying is not such a great experience, is it? But the thing is, human beings have been wanting to fly for a long time, haven't we? Check this out. Check this out. Yes. This is a painting of the Greek myth of Icarus and Daedalus. And the myth goes that they strapped wings onto themselves. I don't know how they did it, doesn't really say. And then they flew for a while. But it was a father and son. Icarus was the son, and he got too close to the physical sun, and his wings melted, and he fell down and died. That's really sad, isn't it? And the dad kept on flying and I guess went home and survived the trip. Now, the funny thing about this, it's not really funny, it's kind of tragic, is that the myth probably originates with a true story. It's probably a father and son somewhere around 1400 BC who tried to fly by strapping wings on, and the son died. And in fact, if we look back at history, there are over 50 documented historical cases of human beings strapping wings onto themselves and then jumping off of really high things like mosques, temples, towers, and castles to try and fly. One of them was in 850 BC, the Celtic king of what would become London strapped wings on himself and jumped off the top of his fortress and died. Isn't that crazy? So, human beings have been wanting to fly for a really long time, right? But what do you think most human beings thought about these people who strapped wings onto themselves and then jumped off of really high buildings? We thought they were crazy, right? Because it's impossible for human beings to fly. Duh. If we'd been made to fly, if God had wanted us to fly, He would have given us wings. It's impossible to fly. And then, of course, it happened, right? And now we've become so used to it, so used to flying, that what is your normal attitude when you're on an airplane? I know some of us might be a little bit scared, but for many of us, especially if we've done it over and over again, our typical attitude is that we are bored out of our minds. We are in a metal box 30,000 feet above the ground. Outside, it's negative 80 degrees because you're so far up in the atmosphere. You're experiencing something that human beings were dying to do, literally, for all of history, and you're bored out of your mind and you just wish you had better leg room. All right? The point is that sometimes things seem impossible until they happen. One more interesting flight fact. Someone actually has managed to fly by strapping wings on and flapping them. It really happened. Actually, it was a student in 2010 from the University of Toronto. This is a contraption that they designed that actually has wings that flap like a bird's wings, and they managed to make it fly under its own power, human power, pedal power. Here he is in this little compartment pedaling away, which made the wings flap, and he managed to fly for about 165 feet. Wow, we finally did it. We strapped on wings and we flew. Who knew Canadians were so awesome? But you notice it looked very different than the original vision, doesn't it? What seemed impossible was only impossible till it happened. But when it happened, it looked very different than the original vision. We're in a series right now leading up to Christmas. This time is called Advent. The series is called The Arrival because Advent means the arrival. It refers to the arrival of the Messiah, Jesus, the Son of God, who was sent to save the world. He came once, and He changed everything. And He will come again, and He will change everything again. We talked last week about prophecy. We talked about the Messiah. We're looking at in this series different prophecies. So those are messages that were given to human beings by God way before Jesus was born, way before he came, telling about what would happen, what it would be like when he came, predicting. And we talked about the very first prophecies of the Messiah last week. So we went back all the way to Genesis. We looked at the very first prophecy, and the things that we drew out of that, we drew out this, that even in despair, we can remember that God knew ahead of time. That's the first point for your notes this morning, and you have some notes in your bulletin if you want to fill in the blanks and follow along. The fact that right after our first ancestors turned away from God, and God had to give all these consequences that we call the curse, all this bad stuff that was going to come into the world, the fact that right in the middle of that, God immediately began telling them about someone who would come one day to make it all right. That fact means that God already knew that we were going to mess up. He already knew all the bad things our ancestors would do. He already knew all the bad things you and I would do in our lives before we were ever born. And he made a plan taking that into account. He made a plan to send his son to save us. And so in our darkest moments, we can remember when something happens to us that we think, how could God have allowed this to happen? He actually already knew it was coming before we were ever born, and he has a plan, if we will trust him and follow him, to lead us out the other side and into the light. Our second point from last week was this: don't listen to all the voices, pay attention to the one voice. And these 2 points we're going to keep coming back to as we go through this series of messages leading up to Christmas, the arrival. We saw that in all of this time when we're waiting for God to fulfill his plan, there are going to be many voices that come at us. Christmas is actually a great illustration of this, isn't it? There are many voices that come at us, commercials on TV, our relatives, all the different traditions that are out there, some of which are good, some not so good, all this noise from our culture, trying to give us a certain vision of life. Not all of it is bad, but the Bible is very clear. We need to be careful that we pay attention first and foremost to the one voice, to the voice of God. And we asked at the end last time, what's your plan? If you have no plan, Christmas is just going to come at you, just like life comes at you, and it's going to overwhelm you. What is your plan this season to pay attention to God's voice above all the other voices that are speaking to you? I hope you made a plan. I'll tell you a little bit more about my plan a little bit later in the message. We're going to jump into some prophecies this morning about the birth of the Messiah, about the birth of Jesus. We're going to look at prophecies around 2 different facts about his birth. Number 1, where he would be born. And number 2, how he would be born. And the interesting thing is that there are several different prophecies about each. And those prophecies looked like they were impossible. It looked like they couldn't all be true of one person until it happened. They looked like they were impossible until it happened. But before we jump into those scriptures, I want to say a little bit about the prophets that we're looking at. And we'll say a little bit about each of the prophets that we're looking at over the next couple of weeks as well. So the prophets, there are a number of prophets in the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, written before Jesus came. There are a number of prophets who made prophecies about the Messiah, about this one who would come. Some of the ones we'll be looking at today include the prophet Micah. Now, Micah was an interesting guy. And interestingly, he and another prophet, Isaiah, who we'll get to in a minute, all lived at the same time. A number of these guys lived at the same time. God sending prophecies to different people about the same Messiah who was going to come, even within one generation. Micah was a man, we don't know a ton about his life. We're going to see a prophecy from him in a moment that is his most famous prophecy currently. But most of what he prophesied about was the fall of Jerusalem, and the reason, so it's being taken over by an enemy army, and the reason he was considered a prophet by the Jewish people was that the stuff that he prophesied actually happened. And that's a pretty good reason to consider someone a prophet, right? If someone comes to you and says, hey, God told me something, and it's going to happen in the future, well, then you have a great way to tell if they really heard from God or if they didn't, don't you? If that really happens, if what they say actually comes true, especially if it's not just some vague mumbo-jumbo that they're giving you, if it really comes true, then you can be pretty certain that they were sent by God, or at least they heard from God. And so this is why Micah's prophecies were recorded and kept as part of the Bible. The stuff he said came true. His most famous prophecy is about where the Messiah would be born, and we'll see that in just a minute. Another prophet we'll look at is Isaiah, a contemporary of Micah. And Isaiah, we'll say a little bit more about him in the coming weeks. He is a huge prophet within the Old Testament tradition. He is the one who gave the most prophecies about the Messiah of anyone. Isaiah is famous because during his generation, along with a king named Hezekiah, they were able to trust God in a way that enabled them to defeat the most powerful army in the world. That's why people thought they should listen to him. He could stare in the face of an enemy army numbering in the hundreds of thousands and say, I'm not concerned at all. God's in control. He can take care of this. We'll be looking at some prophecies, lots of prophecies from Isaiah. And finally, for today, we'll be looking at a prophecy from David. And David wrote, of course, many of the Psalms. He is an interesting prophet. David is best known as a king of Israel and as a warrior. And all of his prophecies come in what we call psalms, but which for David were worship songs. David was a guy who played the guitar. Well, they didn't have guitars yet. What did he play? His lyre or his harp or something. He was a guy who played and worshiped. And many times, interestingly, as he worshiped God, and he would be giving a prayer, crying out to God for some answer, all of a sudden there would be lines within the song that he's writing that couldn't possibly be about him. And they couldn't possibly even be about his generation. They were words that came from God to him that were pointing forward to a time far in the future. And we'll see that many of those lines spoke directly about the Messiah, the one who would come to save the world. So there's three of the prophets that we'll be looking at. Now let's jump into the prophecies for today. First, we're going to look at prophecies about where the Messiah was going to be born. And then we'll look at some prophecies about how he was going to be born. These are quite interesting. So, born where? Now, I told you at the beginning, God's plan, just like flying. God's plan seems impossible until it happens. This is often true in the Bible, and it's often true in the lives of people who are following after God. God tells us something that's going to happen, or he gives us a desire that we should be moving in this direction, or he makes promises to us in the Bible. And in the situations of our lives, in our circumstances, we cannot see how it could possibly come true. It looks like everything has failed, like this promise that God has made could never become reality. And then, if you've been following God for any length of time, you will have experienced this. And then it happens. And then the thing that he said he would do, he does. And your heart is full of joy and amazement. Of course, until you get used to it and then forget all about it, just like the flying on the airplane. Sad story. So let's look at how this worked around the birth of the Messiah. This is Micah's prophecy. I told you we would look at one from Micah that is his most famous prophecy. And here it is. Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, that's just another name for Bethlehem, the town in Israel, are only a small village among all the people of Judah. Yet a ruler of Israel, whose origins are in the distant past, will come from you on my behalf. So here we have Micah in the middle of his prophecies about how Jerusalem was going to fall, about how things were going to go bad for the people of Israel, but then God was going to restore them. He points forward to a time in the future when a king will be born in the city of Bethlehem. And that king, you'll notice he is not ordinary. He's not an ordinary human being. Well, he might be, but there's some strange things about this prophecy, aren't there? Someone's going to be born whose origins are ancient. A super old baby is going to be born. What in the world is Micah talking about? Even within the prophecy itself, it seems almost impossible. We can't see how this would come true. But it gets even stranger because there were other prophecies about where the Messiah would be born that seemed to contradict this one. This is Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 1. This was clearly a section in Isaiah, and we'll be looking at this a number of times in this series. This particular section is very important, Isaiah 9, 1 to 12. We'll even be looking at a couple other verses from this chapter later this morning. But this section was recognized to be about the Messiah because the next verses that follow this are about a light coming into the world and about a ruler whose rule would never end. That means he can't die if his rule is never going to end, right? He's going to have to live forever. But check out how it begins. Nevertheless, so even though all the rest of the stuff that's before this, all kinds of bad stuff's going to happen in the world, that time of darkness and despair will not go on forever. The land of Zebulun and Naphtali will be humbled, but there will be a time in the future when Galilee of the Gentiles, which lies along the road that runs between the Jordan and the sea, will be filled with glory. So here we have a few words that might be hard to understand. Zebulun, Naphtali, Galilee of the Gentiles. Without giving you a long history lesson, I'll just say those three things mean the same region. They all refer to the same area, which was not the area where Bethlehem was. It's actually far north of Bethlehem, around the Sea of Galilee. And so here we have two clear prophecies about the Messiah. One says he's going to be born in Bethlehem, and the other one says he's going to be from Galilee. And it looked like, how could both of these things be true? An ancient baby from Bethlehem who's going to be from Galilee. Now, this gets even muddier. I don't know what my next... It gets even muddier if we look at Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, which was a prophecy that was recognized to be about the Messiah. This word Israel here was recognized even before Jesus' birth as referring to a coming king, not only the nation of Israel. Somehow this Messiah would be called out of Egypt. So now we've got an ancient baby who's going to be from Galilee, or born in Bethlehem, but who's going to be from Galilee, and who's also somehow going to be taken out of Egypt. And finally, I don't have this one on the screen, but in Isaiah 53, verse 8, there is a verse, and we'll look at it in a different connection in a few minutes. But there's a verse that had led many people to believe that when the Messiah came, no one would know where he was from. So now you see we've laid out for you all these prophecies about the Messiah, and before Jesus arrived, it looked impossible that one person could fulfill all of these things. An ancient baby from Bethlehem, but who would be from the region of Galilee, somehow called out of Egypt, and no one would know where he came from. Oh my goodness, what a convoluted mess until it happened. Jesus, of course, we read in Luke chapter 2 that his parents Well, his mother Mary and his stepfather Joseph were forced to go to Bethlehem even though they didn't live there, because that's where their ancestors were from and they needed to be counted in the census. And so this baby, this Messiah, was born in the town of Bethlehem. Not only that, but after that, Herod, King Herod, came with all his soldiers and tried to kill all the little babies. And what did his parents do? They didn't return at first to the region of Galilee because it wasn't safe there. So they fled where? To Egypt. They fled to Egypt, and then when it was safe, God called them back in a dream. So out of Egypt, he called his son. And they returned to the place where Jesus would grow up and do most of his ministry, which was Galilee, the place where he would be from. And even though he had grown up in this village of Nazareth for the most part, people thought they knew where he was from. Really, nobody knew where he was from, except maybe his mom. She might have been the only one, and a few shepherds and a couple of magi who really knew where this baby was from. Because even though he was born in that moment in time, he had always been alive. He was God in the flesh, an ancient baby. Whoa, man, that's crazy. So, God's plan seem impossible until they happen. All right, now let's talk about for a minute. Oops, we're too far there. Are we fighting? No fighting in church. All right, now we're going to talk about the second set of prophecies about how the Messiah would be born. How would he be born? And I want to say a little something here about mountains. All right, you see this landscape here, this view of the mountains. We're going to use this to think about prophecy. When you look at these mountains, what you see is a whole bunch of mountains, right? Everybody say yes. And they look like they're all right there. They look like, in fact, they're all in the same place or very close to each other. Yet, we know some of these mountains, very likely, are huge distances from each other. Even though they look like they're all close and in the same place, this one back here might be 100 kilometers away, while the ones right in front of you might be only a kilometer or two. And so, from our perspective, they're all one thing. But then if we were to walk forward, we would get to one, and much later get to the ones after it. And this is a great illustration of how many of the prophecies that were given to people in the Old Testament, how they work. Prophecies were given to people that were about events right in the time where they lived. Events that were about to happen, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, 70 years in the future. But right in the middle of those prophecies, you sometimes get these statements that are about things that go far beyond the events right in the future. It's almost like the illustration I used before. We're talking about David. He was in worship. I don't know if you've ever been in worship and you've felt the strong presence of God. You felt him communicating to you, saying things to you, filling your heart with love and joy and peace. In those moments, you might get glimpses of places that he is calling you to. And some of those things might require you to do something right then. And some of what he's telling you might be for far later in your life, something that he's preparing you for. But it all comes to you sort of in one moment. And this, in a much more powerful way, was the experience of the prophets. And we're going to need to keep that in mind as we look at some of these prophecies, so we can understand how could part of this prophecy be about what was happening in the prophet's lifetime, and part of it be about things that won't happen until the end of the world. The answer is mountains. Prophecy is kind of like looking at the mountains. All right, so let's take a look here at a few prophecies about how the Messiah would be born, what kind of being he would be. The first one comes from the prophet Daniel. This is in the section of Daniel where he is receiving visions from God about the future. Many of these visions are about the relatively near future, and then all of a sudden you get this. As my vision continued that night, I saw someone like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient One, that is God himself, and was led into his presence. If you were to read the rest of Daniel chapter 7, there's vivid imagery surrounding all of this. Daniel is seeing a vision of God himself. Not actually what God looks like, but a representation that gives Daniel a sense of God's power and majesty and greatness and all the things that God is going to do. And in the middle of that comes this prophecy about the Messiah. And what we learn about the Messiah in this section is that the Messiah would be a son of man. So here it seems clear that the Messiah is going to be a human being. And he's going to be different from God himself. You see that? There's two people presented. There's God in this vision, and there's the Son of Man, this one who's given all the power in the universe by God. Some human being is going to be given all this power. So we see about the Messiah that he would clearly be a human being. Not an angel, not some other kind of weird thing that's different from us. He would be a human being who is given great power by God, the Son of Man. But moving on, let's take a look at a prophecy from David. And this comes in Psalm number 2 and at verse 7. And in this psalm, again, this is a song that David had written where he's worshiping God. He's crying out for help. He's wondering why the world is so dark and the way that it is. Why is it the way that it is? When will it ever change? What is our hope? And here we get a section where up until this point in the psalm, it has appeared that David is talking about himself. And all of a sudden, he starts talking about someone who can't be him. The king proclaims the Lord's decree. The Lord said to me, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." The king proclaims the Lord's decree. So the king now is David. He's been talking about himself, but now he switches to talking about someone else who he has not even introduced in this psalm. And the Lord, that is God the Father, God himself, says to this person, "You are my son, and today I have become your father." So here we see a section that was taken by the Jewish people, a prophecy that was taken by the Jewish people before Jesus ever came, that clearly indicated that the Messiah would be the Son of God. Now to us, if you have been in church for a long time, this might not seem strange that the Messiah would be the Son of Man. He would be a human being, but he would also be the Son of God himself. But this is something that was incomprehensible. It was something that couldn't be understood before Jesus came to the earth. Let's look at two more here. And we'll look at these two together, so I'll read them both. They're both sections from Isaiah chapter 7 and then chapter 9. This is the famous verse, and of course this verse is about how the Messiah would be born. Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14. "All right then, the Lord himself will give you the sign. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. Now it's very interesting here. If you were to look at this section in Isaiah chapter 7, everything in the whole chapter seems to be about a king who was going to be born within Isaiah's lifetime. This king who was about to be born, who would be named Josiah, Isaiah had prophesied about him and all the great things that he would do. And this section, in the moment that Isaiah prophesied, it was originally taken to be about this King Josiah. When this special baby was born, he would be born of a maiden. That's how this word was originally understood, though it can mean either one, a maiden or a virgin. He would be born of a young woman, and then she would give birth to a son, and we would call him Emmanuel, because when this son was born, he would do what is right in God's sight, and God would be with the nation because of that. However, as Isaiah continued through this chapter and the next two to talk about this son who would be born, he goes far beyond. When we get to chapter 9, he goes far beyond anything that Josiah could ever have done. Talking about this same child, he says this: "For to us a child is born. To us a son is given. The government will rest on his shoulders." All that's great so far, right? Referring to this king who was about to be born. "And he will be called Wonderful Counselor." That's excellent. The king's going to be a wonderful counselor. He will be called Mighty God. Whoa! Hang on. You're going to call the king of Israel, you're going to call him God? He will be called Everlasting Father. Wait a minute. The king of Israel is never going to die? He will be called Prince of Peace. Oh, I guess we don't have the next section. The government and its peace, his government and its peace, will never end. This king of Israel will establish a government that never ends. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity. The passionate commitment of the Lord of heaven's armies will make this happen. So you see, Isaiah had been prophesying. He'd been seeing something that was going to happen soon. And then all of a sudden, he hits the mountain range that's far in the back. And he sees things that will happen way in the distant future. And as the Jewish people looked at these verses again and again, after Josiah had died, Josiah was a great king for a little while, and then he died, and his kingdom, his reign, and all the good stuff came to an end. All kinds of darkness came back into the land. And they looked back at these verses and they said this: what in the world did this mean? And they realized, as the Holy Spirit led them, that it meant far more than just that a child would be born of a young woman, and that God would be with us because he would do good things. This verse actually meant that a child would be born not just of a young woman, but of a virgin. So that the child would actually be the Son of God himself. And that not only would God be with us because this ruler's doing good things, but that his name would be God with us. That he himself would actually be the presence of God himself with human beings. And so all of these prophecies come together, what seemed impossible until it happened. That the Messiah, this one to be born and save the world, would be a human being, just like us. Yet he would be the Son of God. He would be someone who in fact was born of a virgin. His presence would mean the presence of God himself. And Jesus, of course, came and fulfilled this very prophecy. It seemed impossible until it happened. So what are we going to do with all of this? God has given us many promises. He's given us many promises in the Bible. And I wonder, oh, stop writing, we're not there yet. I wonder if we believe his promises for us right now. God has given us many promises, and some of those are on the back of your sheet. If you turn that sheet over, you're going to go home today with a number of promises from God. I encourage you to look at them this week. And I encourage you to ask yourself the question, do I believe that God is going to fulfill this promise for me, in my life, in my future? Some of those promises, as you see them, may seem impossible. How could this ever happen? For me, with all the things that have happened in my life, with the situation that I'm in, how could this ever be? Or for some of you, it will be something specific that you thought God was calling you to do. Some task He'd given you. Some promise that you thought He had made you earlier in your life, and you see no way that it's going to be fulfilled now. In these moments, we need to remember what the prophets teach us. That God's plans seem impossible until they happen. And what we need to do in the moments when we are waiting, when we're waiting for God to fulfill His promises, now you can write it down. Don't let the impossible stuff bring you down. Life is full of things that seem impossible, and yet they only seem impossible until God comes through for us and does them. So this brings us right back to those points that we're going to keep in front of us all through the arrival season. All through the arrival season, in those moments of despair, we're going to remember that God already knew all about it. And this season, we're going to make a plan, and we're going to listen to the one voice, to His voice, not to all the rest of the voices. So I encourage you to take those prophecies with you, those promises of God that you have, read through them, and make a plan for how you are going to listen to the one voice this season. What is your plan? I want you to tell me or somebody else after the service this morning. My plan has been memorizing sections of the Bible and doing some stuff with my family. Reading Bible together, reading Scripture together with my family. Those are powerful things, simple things that you can do to listen to the one voice. Let's pray, and we'll continue in worship.